My name is Mohamed Zayani. I'm a professor here at Georgetown, Qatar. And it is my pleasure to chair this second panel on the academic legacy of our friend and inspiring colleague, Amira Sonbol. We have three historians today who will share some of their thoughts and some of their work that relates to Amira's work. Our first speaker will be Randi Deguilhem. She's a professor of history at Marseille University. Our second speaker will be Ramadan Elkhouly, who is a professor of history at the Africa Institute. And our third speaker comes to us from Cornell, and his Professor Mostafa Minawi. We are already running late, but I would be remiss if I don't just tell you maybe just one or two observations about our colleague Amira. I'm not going to take away the time from, since we are the hosts, we're not going to take away the time from our guests, but just two things. One is I want to say how accessible Amira was. And that's a quality. So she was very accessible to us. At the same time, we had to compete for her attention. Why did we have to compete for her attention? Because every time I wanted to talk to her, her office was full with students, and she made us feel guilty to take away that moment of learning from the students. So whatever we needed to talk to her about can wait. If you see the students engaged and the students in her office and being blossoming, and I think that's for us even a learning experience, and that speaks to her as a mentor. Second one, as a mentor in terms of scholarship. So when I came up for promotion to full professor, Amira was the chair. So it was her who had to relay the decision to me. So she called me to her office. I went to her office and she told me, "Congratulations, we approved your thing," and so on and so forth. But then she told me, "Now you have to go out and write your book." And I'm like shocked. I mean, what do you mean? I just wrote the book, and that's what you got me tenure for, promotion for? And she said, that was all apprenticeship, and that was a challenge that I took to heart. And so for the next 5 years, I worked on, if you will, the professional book. That was amateurish. Now this was, and so that was really a teaching moment. That was inspiring. My book just came out this year, and she wasn't acknowledged. The sad truth is that she didn't live to see it. So without further ado, we'll start with the first panel. And please feel free to either come to the podium or be here. Go ahead. For our technical team, some of our presenters have a slide to show, so just to note that.
Thank you very much. And I would like to begin by thanking Professor Rogaya Abu Sharaf for organizing this extremely important event for many of us, and her organizing team here at Georgetown University, Qatar. For me, as for many other people who have already spoken and who will take the floor, I feel honored and gratified and humbled when I think of our relationship, professional or personal, with Amira Sonbol. And it's a one in a lifetime, I would say, opportunity in many ways, our encounters with her. Just a personal word before I start speaking about a journal, Hawa, Journal of Women in the Middle East and the Islamic World. Before I start speaking about that, I would just like to say that acquaintance with Amira goes back to the 1990s, so it's quite a way. And it was within the framework of creating the Syrian Studies Association. So she didn't really work on Syria, but it was in that relationship that I met Amira Sonbol, Nelly Hanna, and some other persons as well. And from that time on, from the 1990s, well, until up until today, that relationship, that friendship, the professional qualities that I was able to learn from her flourished and in many different ways. So I would like to say here my gratitude, express my gratitude to Amira for everything that she contributed to me personally and professionally. Before presenting very briefly the international journal, which she created in the early 2000s, the first, okay, can you go back put on the second one, please? Oh, okay, that's fine. I would like to say, yes, the first journal, the journal which she created, and the first issue, which came out in 2003, is really the focus of my talk. But I think that in many ways it's related to the different remarks which were given by the deans or the ex-deans or the current dean of Georgetown. And it's related also to the first, the second panel here, and probably the panels afterwards. And that her impact of Professor Amira Sonbol had on many generations. So I would like to say that it's an intergenerational impact which she gave us. And it's an impact, it is a legacy and heritage which will, I'm sure, will go on not only with her current students here in Qatar, in the United States, but also in Europe. That's where I live. I live in France. I work in France, Aix-en-Provence, where she is also very well known. Her work and herself is also very well known, as she had done primary research there in the archives in Aix-en-Provence and in Marseille. So it's an international, we already said that, but I would like to emphasize that it's an international figure that we're talking about here. And I will go on to speak now about this review. Yeah, okay. I will go on now to speak about this, about this journal, which is called the Hawa, Journal of Women of the Middle East and the Islamic World. And it took her some time to find this title because she wanted Hawa to be a comprehensive intellectual space for new research and for new paradigms and for new reflections, not only of the Muslim community, but of all of the different communities, religious, ethnic, linguistic, etc., within Dar al-Islam. So this is why she chose these two parts, Journal of Women of the Middle East, which means more than MENA, Middle East and North Africa, but it goes beyond to Indonesia, Malaysia, and other parts of the world as well. When Amira Sonbol created this journal, over 20 years ago now, she approached Brill with the idea of creating an international space, academic space, which was dedicated to publishing research on women in the Middle East and North Africa and beyond, so the Islamic world in general. And it was not something which was given. She had to also fight for it. As Nelly, I remember a plane trip in probably 2001 maybe, going out to Mesa, one of the Middle East Studies Association meetings, I believe maybe San Francisco, but it was a long plane ride. I was on that plane. Professor Nelly was there, and myself, and Amira. And I had no idea that she was creating this journal. And she spoke about it to us, and the problems that the obstacles, not problems, but the obstacles which she encountered in creating this journal. Was it going to sell well? Were people going to be interested? Would there be enough contributors? it was going to be in French and in English, or in English and in French, and perhaps other languages, could have been in Spanish and Italian, according to the contributions. And it was multilingual in the beginning and up until today, even though English is the predominant language. So she had a number of obstacles, which were both of a commercial nature, because she's dealing with Brill, which has to sell, so this journal, but it's also of an academic nature, thinking to herself, will she have enough contributions to this journal to be able to produce 3 issues per year? That's a lot. 3 issues per year. Now it's 4 issues per year. It's usually 2 issues and a double issue, depends on what we have. And despite these obstacles, or perhaps because of these obstacles, she went ahead and she created the journal with all of the academic backing and the commercial backing from Brill. And the first issue was published 20 years ago. And in this first issue, so over 2 decades, this first issue began with an editorial. I'm wondering if you can you go on, please, to the next one? Oh, yeah, that's the 20-year one. Can you go down, please, to the 2003? It's a few slides down. There it is. Yeah, okay. So 2003, and you see it's already also available online. So it's over 20 years ago, and it's one of the first academic journals which was available online. So already, Amira, she had that also, we didn't really speak about that, but she had also that characteristic of hers of making things accessible to the wider audience, not just academic, but to the wider audience as well. And what she wanted to do, Amira Sonbol, what she wanted to do with Hawa, she was interested in, as I said, creating academic space for publication of established scholars, but also of younger scholars. And she encouraged people all over the world on a global scale, truly on a global scale, from Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, the United States, Europe, MENA, Africa, etc. She encouraged young scholars, doctoral students, sometimes even MA students, and civil activists as well, to publish in this journal and to get the word out of their research and also of other areas on which they may be working. So Hawa reflects Amira's her own academic interests in that primary research and calling into question different paradigms, of which Professor Nelly, Professor Asma had already spoken, calling into question. So I look at, even today, I look at Hawa also as a revolutionary space, because we are called upon to publish in that journal, people working not just on women and gender, but working on different issues in some way related to issues related to gender in the larger sense of the term, but working especially from the primary sources and calling into question what's that called? Collective wisdom. Conventional wisdom. So it's an intellectual and it's a revolutionary space. From the very beginning, and Amira talks about this in her editorial, which was published in this first issue in 2003, she speaks about why she wanted to create this academic space. And it's really it's really 3 different reasons in general why she wanted to create this space. Number 1, I'm using her own words here, paraphrasing her own words. It's a journal for the academic study of women and gender in the MENA region and beyond, which she is creating in order to provide a serious scientific forum for the publication of interdisciplinary research, open to all chronology and approaches, all the while publishing work produced by established scholars, and she puts out the call for younger scholars to also publish perhaps even their first article in this journal, which is peer-reviewed and available, as I said, both in the paper form and online. In her editor's note in the opening issue of 2003, She also, at that time, emphasized the growing global importance of women's studies on a global scale, of women's studies. So here we're in 2003, and at that time, well, there was in 1973 in the Lebanese American University, there was already, it was already created, the Women's Studies program was already created there, but it was probably one of the only ones in the Arab world, and there were none in Europe at that time, none. So she also situated her own effort here of creating the journal within the larger movement of women's studies, which was later to be called gender studies. So it was avant-garde, really, in that way as well. And the third reason why she wanted to create Hawa, she was closely related to the movement of Musawa, and I think some people here are connected with Musawa. She was closely related to the creation of Musawa, so it's a civil society association working for the equality of rights of women, and she participated in the founding meetings of Musawa. And in her opening editorial, she also says that this academic space is also a forum for different activists who work with Musawa or other organizations, and they also, of course, peer-reviewed scientific approach, but they also can and do and will publish in Hawa. And these are the three reasons why she created Hawa. And I would like to go back in time. She was the sole editor-in-chief. She had an academic international board working with her. Some of the people who were on the stage during the first, some of the deans who were on the stage here were part of the board of directors and part of the board of directors, the initial board of directors. And I'm looking at my colleague and dear friend, Rogaya Abu Sharaf. In 2012 or 2013, something like that, she felt it was time to give the baton to other people, and she approached the two of us and asked us if we would work together as co-editors-in-chief of Hawa. And I would say maybe with some trepidation, because we didn't know if we could fulfill her footsteps, and I hope we're able to follow at least part of her path-breaking initiatives with Hawa. And we co-edited then the journal for quite a number of years, just up until a few years ago. And I think that this is also very important. It's something that we should think about as well, is that Amira, she knew when she wanted to move on. she created this journal. I gave you those three reasons that she herself talked about in the editorial. But she also knew when it was time to move on to other activities and to give the responsibility and the way of creation to maybe another generation or to another group of scholars. And so we felt, I think, very apprehensive maybe in the beginning. And then we did our best to fulfill the responsibility of being editors-in-chief of Hawa. This is basically what I wanted to say here. I wanted to introduce Hawa. I wanted to, again, say once more that the personal interests, the personal research interests of Amira Sonbol, women and Islamic law, women and questions of marriage, divorce, inheritance, women in Mamluk society, Mamluk history, women and questions of property, women and philanthropy, women and waqf, other questions of women and questions of gender as well, because questions of gender, masculinity, etc., are also published in Hawa. These are her own areas of interest, but they are also but it's also a way of creating new fields of study in publishing them and reading about them and eliciting interest amongst other scholars who read them. And I'm also using this platform here to pay homage again to Amira Sonbol, to, I once more say, express all my gratitude to her, and associating myself, Rogaya, with this international journal, and also calling for contributions for the journal in English, could be in French or, as I said, Italian or Spanish or another language, but calling also for contributions as a way, two things, as a way to honor Amira, and also as a way to move forward with the research that she has done, with the research that we and you are doing, and publishing it in Hawa, which has a worldwide, of course, circulation, is a way of, I think, honoring her legacy. So thank you very much for this platform.
Just for the people who may have been in and out, if you need headsets, please raise your hands and my colleagues will provide you with one for the translation because the lecture is going to be in Arabic.
I forgot I'm blind.
أولا حبيت أشكر دكتورة رقية، حبيت أشكر جورج تاون وكل فريق العمل اللي ساعدونا. كده مسموع؟ حبيت أشكر دكتورة رقية، حبيت أشكر كل فريق جورج تاون اللي ساعدنا. كان نفسي كمان أشكر دكتورة صنبل، دايما اتجمعنا، هي دايما جمعتنا، والنهارده كمان احنا متجمعين عشان خاطرها. دكتورة أميرة صنبل الغائب الحاضر، تعرفت عليها في منتصف العقد الأخير من القرن الماضي في جلسة عن التاريخ العثماني، كانت بصحبة الدكتورة نيلي حنا، ثم خرج الجميع لنادي أعضاء هيئة تدريس جامعة القاهرة، عفوا لأكلة فسيخ. جاء بها أحد الزملاء من بحيرة المنزلة وتحدث الجميع. كنا قرابة تقريبا 9 باحثين في بداية المشوار ما بين ماجستير وما بين بيستعد للتسجيل. هي ظلت صامتة حتى تكلم الجميع، عرفت مشاربهم، فمن زميل يملك حس الفكاهة ويعمل على موضوع خاص بالصراع العسكري بين البيوت العسكر المماليك سيادة البيت القصدولي، فسألته: ما علاقتك بهذا الموضوع؟ أما كنت تفضل الحديث عن دور مهرج السلطان في صناعة القرار؟ وبين زميل آخر يعمل على تاريخ القضاة في العصر العثماني، فسألته: لماذا تكتب عن تاريخ القضاة؟ لماذا لا تكتب عن تاريخ القضاء؟ كيف يساعدنا ذلك في فهم سير القضية وفهم حياة المتقاضين؟ وباحث ثالث يكتب عن المقاومة الشعبية للحملة الفرنسية في الوجه البحري. ولأن الحديث طويل وذو شجون طلبت أن نكون جميعا في ضيافتها. بعدها بعدة أيام كان يوم عاشوراء، اجتمعنا في بيتها في الزمالك على صوت أطباق عاشوراء ومساعدة طه. لم ينقطع الحديث عن الموضوعات الجديدة المسجلة كموضوعات ماجستير ودكتوراه في الجامعات المصرية، لكن الموضوع الجامع لكل أطراف الحديث كان الأرشيف ودار الوثائق. كيف نبحث عن المصادر الأصلية للموضوعات؟ كيف نستقرئ الوثائق؟ أذكر أنها سألت عن التاريخ الاجتماعي. تحدث الزملاء عن كتابات الأساتذة الرواد المؤرخين المصريين، الحركة العمالية في مصر، كبار الملاك، الريف المصري في القرن الثامن عشر وغيرهم. ثم سألت: ماذا عن وثائق الزواج والطلاق؟ كانت إجابات البعض يعني مرتبطة بدور القاضي، مرتبطة بدور الولي في ذلك العقد. ثم سألت عن المجتمع: هل يمكن استخدام هذه الوثائق لكتابة تاريخ الأسرة؟ كتابة تاريخ النساء؟ كيف يمكن لهذه النوعية من الوثائق أن تستخدم في كتابة تاريخ عمل المرأة أو حقوق القاصرات وردا على سؤالها المباغت لماذا المقاومة الشعبية في الوجه البحري، كان جوابي لأني من هناك، بعرف حكاويهم، مواويلهم، قصصهم، أمثالهم الشعبية. سمعت السيرة الهلالية وأدهم الشرقاوي وعنترة والزيني بركات والزيبق، لكن في الكتب الدراسية قرأنا فقط عن عمر مكرم ومحمد كريم وحواليهم جموع من الناس. أحببت أن أعرف من هم هؤلاء الناس وليه. ليه فلاحي ممكن ينطرد من الأرض لو ما دفعش الضرائب أو الحلوان اللي عليها؟ ليه ممكن يدافع عنها؟ سألتني تفتكر لو حاولنا نفهم شوية تاريخ الأسرة من خلال وثائق الزواج والطلاق والأوقاف، ممكن ده يساعدك إنك تفهم شوية مين هم دول الناس؟ ليه عملوا كده أو حتى ليه ما عملوش كده؟ لم يكن لدي جواب. قلت ببساطة رأيت بعض هذه الوثائق في سجلات المحاكم الشرعية، لكن بصراحة أنا لم أطرح مثل هذه التساؤلات على الوثيقة، لم أفكر في طرح هذا السؤال الأصل على الوثيقة. متأكد أني منذ غدا أو من غدا سأقرأ الوثيقة، ولكن بعين مغايرة. قبل أن نغادر مباشرة أمطرتنا بوابل من الأسئلة. هل شاهدتم فيلم أريد حلا للسيدة فاتن حمامة والسيد رشدي أباظة وهو من إنتاج 75؟ هل رأيتم كيف تكابد النساء الأمرين لسنوات في المحاكم وقد تحصل على الطلاق أو لا تحصل عليه كما حدث مع السيدة فاتن حمامة؟ هل ترون في ذلك عدالة؟ كيف كانت تحصل المرأة على الطلاق في العصر العثماني؟ هل قرأتم وثائق عن حالات الخلع؟ كان ذلك قبل صدور قانون الخلع في مصر 2001. قبل أن ينتهي الأسبوع نفسه كان أحد الزملاء قد نجح في الحصول على شريط الفيلم أريد حلا لنشاهده مرات عديدة. أظنها كانت المرة الأولى التي نفكر فيها كطلاب أو مشروع باحثين في الانفلات من أسر الوثيقة، منطوق الوثيقة، وفكرة أن الوثيقة تنطق بالحق، مفهوم أن الوثيقة لا تكذب. لقد فتحت الدكتورة أميرة أمامنا كباحثين شبابا طريقا جديدا، سيلا هادرا من الأسئلة حول كيف نقرأ وثائق التاريخ الاجتماعي. ما هو تاريخ الأسرة؟ السؤال الأهم، ما هي هذه الوثيقة؟ كيف تم إنتاجها؟ من هذا اليوم من منتصف التسعينات، أظن 94 أو 95، عملت معها لسنوات طويلة حول الأرشيف والسجلات والوثائق في البحث عن مئات وثائق الطلاق، صنفتها وفق مذهب القاضي ووفق المكان الجغرافي، مناطق فلاحية، مناطق حضرية، وبدأت تبحث في وثائق الخلع بداية على أنها وثائق طلاق أو وثائق تطليق، وفي كل مرة تواصل الحفر عميقا في الوثائق تصار أسئلة جديدة ومختلفة. كيف كان للنساء أن يطالبن بالعدالة؟ كيف للمحكمة الشرعية أن تحقق العدالة للنساء؟ هل من المنطقي أن تستمر المطالبة النساء بالإنصاف كل هذه السنوات؟ ثم انتقلت إلى كتب الفقه، راجعت عشرات المخطوطات بحثت فيها عن الاختلاف بين الفقهاء، ثم التطور داخل المذهب الواحد. حاولت اختبار ورسم خريطة جغرافية للمذاهب الفقهية في مصر وانتشار وانحسار هذه الحالات. سألتها في مرة وربما مرات عديدة، احنا بندور على ايه؟ عن ماذا نبحث؟ بنبص على الوثائق بس شفنا مئات، مش عايز ابالغ واقول الاف الوثائق، طلاق وخلع. حضرتك بندور على ايه؟ كانت رؤيتها واضحة. نحن لا نبحث عن الخلع لكونه خلعا، نحن نبحث عن ألم النساء في المحاكم المصرية وربما العربية من مشكلات الطلاق التي قد تستمر لسنوات طويلة، وربما يصل الأمر إلى الرفض بعد كل الصعوبات. كيف كانت تتحقق العدالة على مستوى الواقع؟ ليس على المستوى التنظيري والفقهي. لقد كانت تفتش في التاريخ عن الحق والعدل، كانت تنطلق من مشكلة آنية وترجع إلى المصادر الأساسية في التاريخ على حسب تعبيرها لفكفكة هذه المشكلة والبحث عن جذورها. كان الأمر صعبا للغاية، لكنها أصرت على رصد متى بدأ التغير، كيف بدأت هذه العذابات للنساء؟ كيف تنعتق من عشرة زوج لا ترضى الحياة معه؟ كانت منهجيتها للبحث داخل مئات السجلات ومئات الآلاف من الوثائق لحصر متى بدأت المشكلة موضوع البحث وكيف بدأت، ما هو المناخ الثقافي والفقهي حول هذه البدايات، ما هي الأعراف السائدة التي يمكن أن نسميها بمحاولة إنصاف النساء. اعتمد دكتورة سونبول فكرة حصر العينة الوثائقية في سجلات المحاكم العديدة في مصر في موضوع الطلاق والخلع وحقوق القاصرات، كما اعتمدتها في وثائق الشام في البحث عن معارضة المجتمع لعمل المرأة في الأردن أو تصاعد الأصوات لتحجيم وجود المرأة في سوق العمل. اختارت سجلا كل 100 عام، ثم كل 50 عام، ثم 25 عام، ثم تتوالى القسم على 2 كلما تم تحديد نوعية التغيرات الحادثة في الوثائق بالنسبة للحالة الدراسية لحصر بداية التغير. كانت منهجية موفقة جدا، لكن مع بداية اهتمام دكتورة سونبول بتاريخ الأسرة في الخليج منذ قرابة عقدين تقريبا، واجهت تحديا كبيرا، حيث كانت العقبات الأساسية هذه المرة مختلفة عن سابقاتها. فالموضوع نفسه مشكلة. المرأة في الخليج العربي. أذكر أن أحد المستشارين الثقافيين في سفارة عربية في منطقة الخليج طلب الاجتماع معنا لمدة 20 دقيقة. ظل الاجتماع تقريبا ساعة وثلث. بعدها قال: أنا مؤمن تماما بالبحث العلمي، لكن موضوع المرأة في الخليج له حساسية خاصة. متأسف، لن أستطيع كتابة تقرير للسماح لكم بدخول الأرشيف. فبداية كان الموضوع مشكلة، ثم الأرشيف كيف ندخل إليه؟ بعض البلاد في الخليج العربي وقتها لم تكن تملك أرشيف من الأساس، وبعضها كان ممنوعا الدخول إلى هذا الأرشيف. لذلك ثانيا نوعية المصادر وطريقة التعامل معها. فبتذكر دكتورة سونبول في كتابها: لدينا إشكالية كبيرة في الصورة النمطية التي تكتب دائما عن الخليج العربي، وخاصة التاريخ السياسي أكثر من التاريخ الاجتماعي. السبب الحقيقي إنما يعود إلى نوعية المصادر التي يتم الاعتماد عليها، وهي في معظمها الوثائق الأجنبية وخاصة البريطانية، وكذا السجلات التبشرية. فمع أهميتها إلا أنها ترسم صورة محددة لهذه المنطقة. وقد بنى المبشرون صورة للتخلف والاضطهاد الشديد للمرأة، وهي الصورة التي يمكنهم بيعها في الغرب لكسب دعم أكبر. هكذا وجدت في مقابلة الكثرة المفرطة في الوثائق المكتوبة في مصر وبلاد الشام، كانت الندرة المفرطة للوثائق المحلية المكتوبة عن الخليج في منطقة الخليج العربي. مجددا كان لابد من بحث عن فكرة جديدة، وهي تذكر: ليس من المستغرب أن النساء نادرا ما يظهرن في الروايات التاريخية مثل اللاعبين الآخرين في التاريخ الاجتماعي، فقد ظلت مساهمة المرأة غير ملحوظة إلى حد كبير. مع كل هذه العقبات كانت مصرة على الوصول للمصادر الأولية، فوجدت أن الحل الأمثل هو الاعتماد بشكل أكبر على المحكي، الرواية الشفوية، صوت الناس، كذلك الوثائق المكتوبة في الأرشيفات العائلية، أو ما يمكن اعتباره الأرشيفات الموازية. حتى ذلك كان شديد الصعوبة، وربما حتى اليوم، ولأسباب مختلفة يعلمها الجميع في الخليج العربي. ربما منها مثلا عدم قناعة المجتمع. ففي مقابلة مع أحد مسؤولي التلفزيون في المنطقة والسؤال عن تسجيلات المقابلات مع كبار السن، كان متعجبا: ما أهمية هذه التسجيلات لكم؟ ما أهميتها لبحوثكم؟ هي مجرد مواد للوناسة ولتذكر نسمة الأول كنوع من الحنين للماضي وليس للدراسة. لكن اللطيف أن نفس الشخص وبعد نقاش وجدل استمر لمدة نصف ساعة بدأ في الاسترسال والحكي. كانت حكاياته شديدة الأهمية عن تعلمه في الكتاب على يد السيدة أمنة محمود الجيدة. كانت حكاياته مهمة، مصدر ثري جدا عن الطلاب والطالبات والمنهج معلوماته عن المكتبة التي كانت تحتفظ بها، وتضم بضع عشرات من الكتب معظمها تباع في بلاد أخرى. رأت الدكتورة أميرة في الوثيقة المكتوبة في المحكمة الشرعية في فترة الحكم العثماني، وجدت أنها نص صاغه كاتب المحكمة، فهو بمثابة الراوي، صحيح لديه ضوابط فقهية وثقافية لضبط كتابتها، لكن لديه أيضا ثقافته الشخصية كانت تعي ذلك، وهي تحاول استنطاق أصوات النساء من خلالها. اعتبرت أن النص الشفوي لديه راو، وإن لم يلتزم بالضوابط المحكمة للكاتب الوثيقة في المحكمة الشرعية. قابلت بين الروايات المختلفة، كانت تزداد حرصا عندما تسمع روايات محكمة الضبط القصصي من الإخباريات. فعندما استمعت إلى السيدة مريم العجروجة كويتية، وهي إخبارية قديرة تعرف كيف تضبط الرواية عندما تتحدث عن الزواج، عن الزار، عن التعليم، عن دور النساء في المساعدات في تجهيز ما قبل رحلة الغوص، عن المرأة البدوية، روايتها متسقة، تعرف من أين تبدأ وإلى أين تصل. لكن دكتورة أميرة أصرت على أن نبحث عن أخريات يحدثنها عن نفس الموضوع لتتثبت من الرواية. لن أطيل عليكم على كل الأحوال. حتى لا أطيل على حضراتكم، فقد تجولت الدكتورة أميرة صنبل بين أروقة المحاكم خلال سجلاتها، انتقلت من محكمة إلى أخرى في القاهرة، استكشفت خبايا وأضابير محكمة الإسكندرية ودمياط والمنصورة والبحيرة، أغرمت أيما غرام وهي تسمع حكايا محاكم الصعيد، بني سويف وأسيوط. تجولت بين رديهات محاكم حواضر بلاد الشام، القدس، دمشق، بل وحتى نابلس وعجلون وإربد. سمحت لها الأوراق المبعثرة التي وجدتها في بدروم أحد مباني المؤسسات العدلية في عدن أن تستكشف حكايا اليمنيات، كل ذلك لمحاولة استنطاق وثائق الأحوال الشخصية والأوقاف، علها تسمع أصوات النساء. قارنت بين منطوق الوثائق والمصادر الفقهية وكتب الحسبة، استمعت إلى عشرات الحكايات الشفوية، راجعت ما وصل إليها من أدبيات هذه الفترة الزمنية، تابعت أحوال فلاحي يوسف الشربيني في حكاياته المسماة قصيدة أبو شدوف. غصها سماع صوت فلاح يحيى حقي في يومياته في الأرياف بعد أن قبضت عليه السلطة واتهمته بالمخالفة أنه غسل هدومه في الترعة، بل وطبقت عليه جزاء. سمعت صوته وهو ينادي: يا سعادة القاضي، ربنا يعلي مراتبك، تحكم عليا بغرامة لأني غسلت هدومي؟ قالوا لا، لكن غسلت هدومك في الترعة. طب واغسلها فين؟ رأت الحيرة على وجه القاضي ممثل العدالة وهو يفكر، لا يملك جوابا لأنه يعرف أن هذه القرى لا يوجد بها مصدر آخر للماء حتى للشرب، ومع ذلك يطلب إليه أن يخضع إلى قانون قد استورد من الخارج. فيلتمس القاضي ردا من النيابة ليأتيه بالخبر اليقين. النيابة ليس من شأنها أن تبحث أين يغسل هذا الرجل ملابسه، لكن ما يعنيها هو تطبيق القانون. ليصمت القاضي قليلا ويهز رأسه ثم يقول في سرعة من يزيح عن كاهله حملا: غرامة 20 قرش. ويصرخ الفلاح مجددا: هي دي العدالة يا حكومة؟ لقد عاشت الدكتورة أميرة حياتها تسعى إلى الاقتراب من الحقيقة أو محاولة ملامستها. بحثت بين طيات الوثائق عن العدل وكيف السبيل إليه. هل اختلف مفهوم العدالة من فترة تاريخية إلى أخرى؟ أظنها سعت إلى مفاهيم العدل الإنساني، فالعمل على تاريخ الأسرة يجعل من الصعب البحث في مضمون الوثيقة، بل البحث أبعد من مجرد منطوق النص إلى فكرة العدل والحق. أخيرا، كنت قد افترضت العنوان لمشاركتي هذه دكتورة أميرة صنبل الغائب الحاضر، وافترضت أن ذلك يمثل موقفي منها، فهي وإن غابت لكنها بالنسبة لي حاضرة. لكن عندما عدت إلى الجامعة رأيتها، نعم رأيتها في حضراتكم، في زملائها، أصدقائها، محبيها. نظرت إليها في طلابها، وجدت أفكارها تنبض بالحياة، وهي من خلقت جيلا جديدا من الباحثين يهتم بالوثائق المحلية المكتوبة والشفوية جنبا إلى جنب مع وثائق المحتل والمبشر، آملين ملامسة الحقيقة. رأيتها في طالبتها التي تبنت فكرة جمع الروايات الشفوية والعمل على تصنيفها بما يضمن الحفاظ على هذه الذاكرة الجماعية الحية للمجتمع الخليجي وإتاحتها كمصدر مهم لدراسة مجتمعات الخليج العربي، وذلك لأنها آمنت بما ذكرته دكتورة أميرة صنبل في كتابها نساء الخليج، هو عندما قالت مشروع موجه لإيجاد مصادر لدراسة تاريخ المرأة في الخليج. إن هناك في الواقع تاريخا غنيا جدا يجب البحث عنه واستكشافه وتقديمه كمساهمة في فهم أكبر لتاريخ الخليج والعالم العربي، وكذلك تاريخ المرأة المسلمة والنساء في كل مكان. رأيت تجسيدا لأفكار لطالما نادت بها من ضرورة وجود دار للوثائق لجمع وتصنيف وحفظ ذاكرة المجتمع القطري. وجدت أفكارها تنبض بالحياة، وأنا أنفق الشهور الأربعة الأخيرة للانتهاء من إعداد كتاب وثائقي بمجلداته الأربع لنشر وثائق وحدة أرشيفية صنفت أوراقها خطأ على أنها كتاب وليست وثائق، مع أنها في مكتبتي منذ عام 1999، وكانت قد طالبتني مرارا بضرورة العمل على نشرها. انتهيت الآن من إعدادها للنشر تحقيقا لرغبتها. الأساتذة والزملاء الأفاضل، كانت هذه بعض ومضات عايشتها مع الأستاذة الدكتورة أميرة صنبل الغائب الحاضر، فهي من النساء اللائي يعشن في غيابهن، وهؤلاء لا ينسون. شكرا لكم.
No, it's not coming up. What did we do last time that made it work? I haven't changed the settings. My email's on the screen, please. Just. Now I need to get this up. There we go. All right. Can you hear me well? Great. So it is almost 6 o'clock and I'm standing between you and break. So I will try very hard not to go too long. So, all right. So I never met Professor Sonbol, but I know Professor Sonbol like a lot of us do in academia, particularly in the States, through her work. Her work was incredibly influential for us. We get introduced to it usually in graduate school, and for a lot of us, it gave us zero excuses not to excavate women's lives. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this through a case study. I'm honored to have been invited. Is this, it keeps flashing here. Is it flashing up there? Great, okay. So I'm honored to have been invited to this symposium to celebrate Professor Sonbol's legacy and enduring impact on the field of Middle Eastern studies and the discipline of history, particularly legal and gender history, in which he was a true pioneer. I remember being introduced to Professor Sonbol's work as a grad student at NYU, where Professor Leslie Pierce had a unit for our comprehensive exams on the use of Sharia records for the writing of women's history. More than being introduced to the utility of legal documents to access the lives of women who are often left in the shadows of social and cultural histories of the region, I learned that women history is history, and that it is not a niche endeavor. In other words, women's history illuminates the very experience of living in the domestic and public spheres in many parts of the world, and in my case, in the urban spaces of the Ottoman Empire. Whether it is the mixed court records, the local Sharia court records, or national court records later on in places like Egypt or Jordan, Professor Sonbol showed us how we can access intercommunal relations, gender relations, and even citizenship and belonging within the state, and how it changed if we look in the right places, always centering the role of women's history, the role that women's history plays in our understanding of society, particularly that of Muslim society. I took inspiration from Professor Sonbol as I dug deep into the court, police, and Secret Service records to uncover the tragic events of one Circassian woman's life and death in the first decade of the 20th century in Istanbul, and how those events were used even in the Ottoman Parliament to undermine the political career of her husband, an Arab Ottoman parliamentarian by the name of Shafiq Pasha. That's Shafiq. The assumption that were made about this woman whose name was Ni'mat, that's her, as a Muslim Circassian woman, wherever her name came up, was that because she's Muslim and Circassian, she must have been a concubine. The assumptions that in Muslim society at the turn of the century, Muslim women enjoyed very limited freedoms in contrast to non-Muslim women who had the freedom to lead an active social life was challenged over and over by Professor Sonbol's findings. Professor Sonbol's legacy for me is one of the importance of political engagement with scholarship in a way that makes you want to go beyond assumptions about Muslims and Muslim societies, and particularly the life of Muslim women. So I dug deeper, and what I found changed the way I looked at the book in general, not just the life of this one woman, as well as, in my case, the relationship between Turkish and Arab societies in Istanbul at the turn of the century. So this case started for me when I looked at the records from a newspaper that was published in 1910 called Lisan al-Hal, and it was published in Beirut. There was a column called A Painful Incident, in which the author says that in the parliament, i.e. in Istanbul, an incident took place that harms every honest Ottoman who loves his country and hopes for the unity of its men and the extraction of all causes of conflict from their hearts. It continued to say that Shafiq Pasha, who is a parliamentarian representing Damascus, was leaving one day from the parliament when he ran into Talat Bey, the Minister of Internal Affairs, who exchanged verbal greetings with Shafiq, but Shafiq refused to shake his hand. As Talat Bey continued on one or two steps further, he stopped and turned to Shafiq Bey and asked him, "Why did you not shake my hand?" Shafiq answered, "I will not shake the hand of a minister before the killer of Ahmed Bey, who is a journalist that used to write critically about the leading party, CUP, was killed, and his killer was never found." Talat Bey turned pale and got very angry and said to Shafiq, "Can a man like you, who turned his son into Sahura," which I learned is a mummy in reference to the pharaohs, have the nerve to say this? The writer of this column explains, this is in reference to Shafiq's son, who was born to him by his wife now his ex-wife, Nimet, not his ex-wife, she had passed away, his wife before she passed away. He didn't mention her name, he didn't talk about her, she was just his wife, who died 2 days after the birth of the son, or that's what they think. However, it was very controversial. Some people accused him of killing her, some people accused him of killing his son, and other things that have to do with fraud and inheritance. The two men continued to exchange insults until one of the deputies from Aleppo, Ali Janani Effendi, who's better known for participating in the genocide against the Armenians, attacked Shafiq, but those around him stopped them from starting to punch each other in the face, and instead they set a time to have a duel outside of Istanbul Club. The duel never took place because apparently Ali Janani never showed up. This is where it stops in the article. So it's left to the historian to follow the pieces of the story and understand what drove a deputy to challenge a fellow deputy to a duel in 1910. In fact, it was a much more serious accusation that was being leveled against him in the lower chamber of the parliament. On January 1st, 1909, some deputies pushed to reopen this investigation about Shafiq Pasha publicly while in the parliament. A general committee read the files on him, and somebody called Prince Mohamed Arslan, that some of you would know if you work on that region, who's a deputy from Latakia at the time, stood up to defend Shafiq Pasha. On the other end, somebody called Ahmed Mahir, who is a deputy from Kastamonu in northeast Anatolia, complained that all of the evidence given against him is actually just hearsay and gossip. Noise rose from the crowds. Different deputies started shouting, saying that he might have killed his wife, or even worse, killed his son, his newborn son. Emmanuel Karasu Effendi, a deputy from Salonika, stood up to speak against Shafiq, but the head of the lower chamber of deputies stopped him finally and said that since there was no real evidence and this is all gossip, we need to stop debating this. They were trying to get him kicked out of the parliament. The tragic circumstances of the death of his wife, whose name is Nimet, and their newborn son continued to be hashed out in public, but usually in gossipy whispers. They would continue to haunt him as political opponents used this issue repeatedly to try to stop his political career. So me, inspired by Professor Sonbol's use of court records, was not satisfied. I was able to go beyond the hearsay from the newspapers and dug into the court records in Istanbul, as well as some of the police records of the investigation, where I learned much more about the life of this woman who was simply described either as a widow of her ex-husband or as a wife of Shafiq. Through the records of the Ministry of Justice, Religious Affairs, and police records reports, I found out that the incident took place 5 years earlier in their house in Tashfiqiyya. The details of the documents investigation are impressively thorough. You do not need to rely on gossip. Interviews were conducted with all of those involved, including the family servants, the mayor, doctors on hand, and Shafiq himself. There were 4 doctors on hand. What the investigations revealed was that there was no doubt that Nimet died before the child did, so he didn't kill her, which eliminates any claims to Nimet's inheritance by her father, which I had to dig up into Sharia records to figure out why is her father involved. Turns out that her father was the one that actually started those rumors, saying that he killed her and then killed her son to get her inheritance. The investigation continued because questions remained as to whether the child died before or after his mother, because that would determine who would get to inherit the money. However, there was many discrepancies in Shafiq's testimony, and the possibility of the child having died before he was even able to register him and get him an ID, i.e. he was not in the eye of the state still a real person, coupled with the fact that there were several charitable endowments that were under Nimet's name, which means the state is involved, including a magnesium mine in the province of Hudavendigar in Anatolia, amongst the inheritance. The investigators recommended that the case of fraud, not of murder, proceed. However, at that time, before the Young Turk Revolution, Shafiq was in the employment of the palace. The case could not proceed without the explicit permission of the Sultan. Shafiq's connection helped him escape persecution, as the royal decree never came from the Sultan, even though the request was sent and acknowledged by the Public Debt Commission's office where Shafiq had worked. The damage to Shafiq's reputation was already done, however, and their protection of being close to the Sultan became a liability after 1908 when the Sultan was deposed. The accusation that he made his son into a mummy for a couple of days until he was able to register him fraudulently to be able to inherit his wife's assets through his son never leave him until his death when he was hanged. However, what about Nemat? What about Nemat? She was much more than a wife. She was much more than a widow of her ex-husband. Here we learn that Nemat was not actually a Circassian concubine. She was a very rich socialite who participated in many charitable events. Nemat was the widow of a famous Grand Vizier, Ahmed Pasha, who was the Grand Vizier between 1891 and 1895. She inherited his wealth. He spent most of his last years in his native Syria and died from tuberculosis. Many had asked for Nemat's hand after she became available, but she passed them all up for Shafiq, who lived on her street, and that was a controversial decision. Nemat was born and raised in a Circassian majority village. That's true enough. She was Circassian, that was true enough, but she was not a concubine. She grew up in Hurdaz, or what is now Hafsa Jafislik. Nemat was very interested in philanthropy even before she married the Grand Vizier, earning her the Ottoman Medal of Compassion, Shifakat Nishani, which you see here. She's wearing it in one of the parties. This is one, she's from the Khedivil family, actually. She used to summer in Istanbul, and they were best friends. Anyway. Her father owned a mill and a hotel, amongst other properties. One of the family's claims to fame was that story of Mostafa Kemal Atatürk staying in their hotel during the War of Independence. Nemat was not the only one to marry a well-known statesman in her family. Her three sisters also married Ottoman diplomats, statesmen, and military men, creating a robust network through marriage relations. She didn't need Shafiq. So it makes sense that Nemat had plenty of suitors once she was available. Shafiq, who was a widower himself at the time, might have been a convenient but not obvious choice. Though we do not have records of her birth, if the picture of when she got married is an indication, she was a fairly young woman who was married to a 40-year-old at that time. This is a picture from her wedding where he's ripped out, in case you're wondering. We don't know where the other side is. I'm assuming somebody burnt it down. So why am I bringing this up? A lot of people would not even have thought about going deep to figure out how a woman on her own actually lived. The more interesting thing would be the political events. People like Professor Sonbol do not allow us to use the excuse that we cannot access women's lives if we look at governmental documents. You can look at other documents, and they're everywhere. And the Ottoman documents are now incredibly accessible. You just need to learn Ottoman. I'm so grateful to Professor Sonbol for providing me and many in my generation an example, and to encourage us not to be satisfied with stories of women simply as widows or wives or daughters or mothers, but to see how they were holders of wealth, social capital, and much more. Nemat stands as a historical figure of importance on her own, and much more needs to be learned about her as we continue to see how Muslim women, in this case elite Muslim women in Istanbul, are often placed on the margins of history when they lived at the center of the political and social life of their time, both in their life and, in her case, in her death. Thank you very much.